The sound of shattering glass exploded through the silent exam hall like a gunshot. Alexis Beaumont, 28 and hunched over her international relations final, felt her body instinctively drop low as three black-clad figures burst through the third-floor windows on rappelling lines. While her classmates screamed and dove under desks, Alexis remained perfectly still, her trained eyes automatically cataloging tactical entry patterns, equipment configurations, and threat assessments that no ordinary graduate student should have recognized. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lead operator's eyes swept the room before locking onto Alexis with laser precision. Alexis Beaumont, Commander Ethan Cross called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. We need to talk. Professor William Kensington stood frozen behind his desk, his mouth agape, as his quiet, unremarkable student became the focal point of what appeared to be a military operation. The same student who struggled with public speaking, who sat in the back row taking careful notes, who seemed intimidated by classroom debates about foreign policy, this was who Navy SEALs had just conducted a high-risk insertion to reach. Alexis felt 23 pairs of eyes boring into her, but her attention remained fixed on the tactical team that had just turned her carefully constructed world upside down. 3 years. She had managed to stay invisible for 3 years at Northfield University, blending into the background of lecture halls and study groups, presenting herself as just another veteran using her GI Bill benefits to earn a degree. She had perfected the art of being overlooked, of dampening her natural confidence until she appeared uncertain and struggling. But the way she had reacted to the breach, the immediate tactical assessment, the controlled breathing, the instinctive positioning that put her back to the wall with clear sight lines to all entrances, had betrayed years of military conditioning that civilian students simply didn't possess. Ma'am, Commander Cross continued, approaching slowly with his hands visible but ready, we need you to come with us. There's been a situation. His tone was respectful but urgent, the kind of voice that brooked no argument. Alexis recognized it immediately as the communication style used when operational security was paramount and time was critical. Her classmate, Samantha Clark, who had spent the semester making snide comments about older students taking spots from real candidates, stared in shock from beneath her desk. Owen Fletcher, the only student who had ever offered to study with Alexis, looked between her and the SEALs with growing confusion. Even Brittany Walsh, the department's star student who treated everyone else like intellectual inferiors, seemed too stunned to speak. I don't know what you're talking about, Alexis said quietly, though her voice carried none of the uncertainty that usually characterized her classroom contributions. The SEALs exchanged glances. They had clearly expected this response. Professor Kensington found his voice. Excuse me, this is highly irregular. You can't just burst into my classroom and... Sir, Petty Officer Parker interrupted politely but firmly, this is a matter of national security. Ms. Beaumont needs to come with us immediately. The words national security hung in the air like a physical presence. Alexis felt her carefully constructed academic identity crumbling around her. For 3 years, she had attended every class, completed every assignment, and participated in every discussion as if she were genuinely learning these concepts for the first time. In reality, she had lived these foreign policy theories, had been deployed in the gray zones between diplomacy and warfare that her textbooks could only theorize about. There must be some mistake, Alexis insisted, but her body language had already shifted. The hunched shoulders and uncertain posture had straightened into something more commanding. Her eyes moved with tactical precision, calculating distances, escape routes, and potential threats in a way that screamed military training to anyone who knew what to look for. Staff Sergeant Marcus Davis stepped forward, his expression sympathetic but resolute. Shadow, we know you're here. The situation in Kandahar has escalated beyond our current capabilities. We need the Wolfpack operational again. The words hit Alexis like physical blows. Shadow, Wolfpack, code names she hadn't heard in 3 years, identifiers from a life she had tried desperately to leave behind. Around the classroom, students began whispering, their voices creating a susurrus of confusion and speculation. Who is she? Someone whispered. What's shadow mean?
Is she some kind of spy? Professor Kensington looked at his grade book as if it might provide answers. Alexis Beaumont, B+ average, quiet participation, struggled with oral presentations, wrote competent but unremarkable papers on international conflict resolution. Nothing in her academic record suggested any connection to military operations, let alone the kind that warranted SEAL team extraction. But the evidence was undeniable. The way she held herself now, the way her eyes tracked movement, the calm control in her voice despite the chaos, this was not the uncertain graduate student who had been sitting in his classes for 3 years. "I'm a student," Alexis said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I'm taking my finals. I don't know anything about any situation in Kandahar." Commander Cross pulled out a satellite phone and showed her the screen. Even from across the room, Professor Kensington could see what appeared to be real-time intelligence footage. Burning buildings, tactical movements, coordinates that meant nothing to an academic, but clearly meant everything to the woman who had been hiding in his classroom. "The asset you extracted is compromised," Cross said quietly. 18 months of intelligence gathering is about to be burned. We need someone who knows the terrain, knows the language, and knows how to get our people out alive. We need Shadow. Alexis closed her eyes, and for just a moment, Professor Kensington saw something that looked like grief cross her features. When she opened them again, the transformation was complete. The uncertain student was gone, replaced by someone whose presence seemed to fill the room despite her modest height. "How many?" she asked, her voice carrying an authority that made several students unconsciously straighten in their seats. 7 operatives, including Thompson. The name Thompson seemed to hit Alexis like a physical blow. Her jaw tightened, and Professor Kensington noticed her hands form involuntary fists before she caught herself and relaxed them. "Professor?" Alexis said, turning to Kensington, with a respect that had always seemed genuine but now carried new weight. "I'm going to need an incomplete on this exam." The understatement of it, requesting an incomplete while Navy SEALs waited to extract her for a classified mission, broke the tension just enough for nervous laughter to ripple through the classroom. As the SEALs prepared to escort her out, Alexis paused and looked back at her classmates. For 3 years, she had sat among them, letting them believe she was struggling to understand concepts she had lived and breathed in some of the world's most dangerous places. She had let Samantha Clark condescend to her about basic geopolitical theory, while possessing operational knowledge that had shaped actual policy decisions. "Take care of yourselves," she said simply, though her eyes lingered on Owen Fletcher, the only student who had ever treated her with genuine kindness, rather than pity or dismissal. As they prepared to leave, Commander Cross paused at Professor Kensington's desk. "Sir, Miss Beaumont's academic records are classified as of now. Any discussion of today's events could compromise ongoing operations." Professor Kensington nodded numbly, still trying to process that his quiet, struggling student was apparently someone important enough to warrant emergency military extraction. The last thing Alexis heard as the SEALs led her toward the window was Samantha Clark's voice, small and confused. But she was failing international relations theory. The irony wasn't lost on Alexis. She had been pretending to learn about international relations while her own classified operations had probably influenced the very theories her classmates were studying. As she prepared to rappel from the third-floor window, a movement that felt as natural as walking after 3 years of pretending to be afraid of heights, she wondered if her carefully constructed academic life would survive whatever was waiting for her in Afghanistan. Behind her, 23 students and 1 professor watched in stunned silence as their unremarkable classmate disappeared into a world they were only beginning to realize they had never understood. 6 months earlier, Alexis Beaumont had walked into Professor Kensington's Advanced International Relations seminar carrying a worn backpack and the carefully cultivated appearance of someone who didn't quite belong. She chose a seat in the 3rd row back. Not so far back as to seem disengaged, not so close as to draw attention, and opened a notebook that she would fill with observations she already knew by heart. Today, we'll be discussing the complexities of counterinsurgency operations in asymmetric warfare environments,
Professor Kensington had announced that first day, completely unaware that the quiet woman in the faded jeans had personally conducted such operations in 3 different countries. Alexis had dutifully taken notes, nodding thoughtfully when Kensington explained theories she had helped develop in classified Pentagon briefings. When he discussed the challenges of cultural integration in military operations, she had bitten her tongue to keep from mentioning the 18 months she had spent embedded with Afghan tribal leaders, speaking fluent Pashto and Dari, while coordinating intelligence networks that had saved countless American lives. The problem with most academic approaches to international relations, Samantha Clark had announced during that first seminar, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never seen theory tested by reality, is that they fail to account for the human element in warfare. Real operators would never be able to navigate the cultural nuances that textbooks make sound so simple. Alexis had smiled politely and made a note in her margins, while internally recalling the 3-hour negotiation she had conducted with a tribal elder in Helmand Province, switching seamlessly between diplomatic protocol and local customs to secure safe passage for a humanitarian convoy. She had been known then as Shadow, a designation earned not for stealth, but for her ability to move between worlds, adapting her persona so completely that she became whatever the mission required. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For 2 years after her medical discharge from the Army, Alexis had struggled with civilian life in ways that had nothing to do with physical injuries. The doctors had cleared her for full duty after the IED explosion that had killed her team leader and best friend, Staff Sergeant Maria Thompson. But Alexis knew that some wounds couldn't be seen on X-rays or MRI scans. She had tried working as a private contractor, then as a consultant for defense firms, but every position felt like a reminder of the life she was no longer sure she wanted to live. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in war zones made grocery shopping exhausting. The tactical thinking that had made her invaluable to special operations made normal conversations feel impossibly shallow. When she had finally decided to use her GI Bill benefits, Alexis had chosen Northfield University specifically because it was small, quiet, and far from any military installations. Vermont felt like the opposite of everywhere she had been deployed: peaceful, predictable, safe. She had enrolled in international relations not because she needed to learn about global politics, but because she hoped studying them from an academic perspective might help her understand whether the work she had done overseas had actually mattered. The irony was that she had become genuinely invested in her studies, not because the material was new, but because seeing it through civilian eyes had given her a different perspective on decisions she had helped make in classified briefings. Professor Kensington's theoretical frameworks helped her process experiences that had been too immediate and dangerous to analyze in the moment. Owen Fletcher had been the first person to show her genuine kindness without pity. A doctoral candidate in political science, he was older than most of the other students and seemed to understand that not everyone's path to higher education was straightforward. He had never asked intrusive questions about her background, never made assumptions about why she sometimes seemed tired despite sleeping well, never commented on the fact that she instinctively positioned herself with her back to walls and clear sight lines to exits. "You have interesting insights," he had told her after a seminar on conflict resolution. "They don't sound like they come from textbooks." Alexis had deflected with a self-deprecating comment about watching too many documentaries, but Owen's observation had made her more careful about her contributions to class discussions. She had begun second-guessing herself, offering tentative opinions instead of confident analysis, asking questions about concepts she could have explained better than the professors. The hardest part had been watching her classmates struggle with concepts that felt elementary to her. When Brittany Walsh spent 3 weeks researching the political implications of drone warfare, Alexis wanted to explain that the real challenge wasn't political, it was the psychological impact on operators who conducted remote strikes, then went home to help their children with homework.
When Samantha Clark wrote a paper on intelligence gathering techniques that contained fundamental errors about operational security, Alexis had to physically restrain herself from offering corrections.
But the role-playing had served a purpose beyond hiding her identity. For the first time in her adult life, Alexis had been able to observe international relations from the perspective of someone who wasn't responsible for life and death decisions. She could engage with theoretical frameworks without the weight of knowing how those theories played out when bullets were flying and people were dying. Her professors had been uniformly kind, if somewhat concerned about her academic performance. Dr. Margaret Caldwell, the department dean, had called her in twice to discuss academic support services, clearly believing that Alexis was a struggling veteran who needed additional help transitioning to civilian education. The well-meaning offers of tutoring and extended deadlines had been both touching and frustrating. Many of our veteran students find the transition challenging, Dr. Caldwell had explained during their last meeting. There's no shame in needing extra support. Your perspectives are valuable, even if your test scores don't always reflect your potential. Alexis had accepted the offered accommodations gracefully, using them not because she needed them academically, but because they reinforced the image of someone who was working hard to overcome limitations, rather than someone who was deliberately underperforming to maintain cover. The closest she had come to breaking character was during a simulation exercise in Professor Kensington's crisis management course. Students had been assigned roles in a hypothetical international incident involving hostage negotiations in a Middle Eastern country. Alexis had been assigned the role of a junior State Department analyst. Ironic, considering she had actually consulted on similar real-world scenarios. As her classmates struggled with basic protocol and cultural considerations, Alexis had found herself unconsciously taking charge, offering suggestions that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what any textbook could provide. She had caught herself just as Professor Kensington began looking at her with curious interest and had quickly retreated back into her role as an uncertain student seeking guidance. "You seem to have natural instincts for this kind of work," Professor Kensington had observed after the exercise. "Have you considered a career in foreign service?" The question had been innocent, but it had highlighted the fundamental challenge of her situation. She was hiding not just her past, but her capabilities. Every day, she made herself smaller, quieter, less competent than she actually was. It was a different kind of operation than anything she had conducted overseas, but in some ways, it was the most challenging mission she had ever undertaken. The persona she had created, uncertain, struggling, earnest, had become so practiced that sometimes she almost believed it herself. There were moments when she genuinely felt like the student she was pretending to be, when the weight of her operational experience felt more like a burden than an asset. But the morning the seals had burst through her classroom window, all of that careful construction had crumbled in an instant. The mention of Thompson's name had shattered the wall she had built between her two identities, forcing her to confront the reality that some parts of her past would never stay buried.
The week before the seal extraction, Alexis had been sitting in the university library's quiet corner, surrounded by towers of books she didn't need to read, but studied anyway to maintain her cover. Her international relations final was approaching, and she had been carefully preparing to perform at the B+ level that would keep her invisible among her classmates, competent enough to avoid academic probation, unremarkable enough to avoid scrutiny. Alexis, right? Samantha Clark had appeared at her table, designer coffee in hand, and an expression that mixed condescension with what she probably thought was kindness. "I couldn't help but notice you've been struggling with the foreign policy analysis assignments." Alexis had looked up from her notes that contained simplified versions of strategies she had personally implemented in classified operations, and forced herself to appear grateful for the attention. "Yeah, it's challenging material," she had replied, internally cringing at the admission. "I've been thinking," Samantha had continued, settling into the chair across from her without invitation. "Maybe we could form a study group. I mean, some of us have been talking, and we feel like the veteran students might benefit from working with people who have stronger academic backgrounds." The casual dismissal had stung more than Alexis had expected. She had faced down insurgent commanders and negotiated with arms dealers, but something about Samantha's well-meaning condescension had made her feel genuinely small for the first time in years. "That's very kind," Alexis had managed, though she could feel her jaw tightening in a way that would have warned her military colleagues that someone was about to have a very bad day. Brittany Walsh had joined them then, sliding into the conversation with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her intellectual superiority. "We were just discussing the complexity of modern warfare theory," she had announced, as if Alexis hadn't been present for the beginning of the conversation. "It's fascinating how different academic analysis can be from what military people actually experience in the field." The irony was almost physically painful. Alexis had spent 3 years listening to these students discuss theories she had helped develop, watching them debate the effectiveness of strategies she had implemented, hearing them confidently correct each other about realities she had lived through personally. It must be difficult," Brittany had continued, transitioning from a more practical background to analytical thinking. "The military teaches people to follow orders, not to question underlying assumptions or consider alternative perspectives." Alexis had nodded politely, remembering the countless hours she had spent in classified briefings doing exactly that, questioning assumptions, analyzing alternatives, developing innovative solutions to complex geopolitical problems. Her military career had been built on her ability to think critically and adaptively, but explaining that would have blown her cover completely. "Actually," Owen Fletcher had interrupted, appearing at their table with his own stack of books, "I think military experience probably provides perspectives that pure academic study can't replicate. Different doesn't mean inferior." Owen's gentle defense had been appreciated, but it had also highlighted how completely my classmates misunderstood my background. Even Owen, who treated me with genuine respect, saw me as someone who needed protection from the more academically aggressive students. The conversation had continued with Samantha and Brittany offering increasingly patronizing advice about study techniques and time management, while I maintained my role as the grateful but struggling student. I asked appropriately basic questions about concepts I could have taught graduate-level courses on, had expressed uncertainty about theories I had personally proven in operational environments. "The thing about counterinsurgency," Brittany had explained with the confidence of someone whose knowledge came entirely from textbooks, "is that success depends on winning hearts and minds. Most military operations fail because they focus too much on tactical victories instead of relationship-building strategies." Alexis had bitten her tongue to keep from mentioning the 8 months she had spent embedded with village elders in Kandahar province, drinking tea and building relationship trusts that ultimately led to the identification of 3 major IED networks. Instead, she had nodded thoughtfully and made notes about relationship-building strategies in her notebook. The most painful part had been watching Owen try to include her in conversations where she could have provided insights that would have advanced everyone's understanding. During discussions about intelligence gathering, he had asked her opinion about how military training might inform academic research methods. Alexis had been forced to offer vague, uncertain responses about following procedures, when she could have explained sophisticated analysis techniques that weren't even covered in their graduate curriculum. Professor Kensington had been more subtle in his assumptions, but no less limiting. During office hours, he had frequently steered their conversations toward academic support services, career counseling, and alternative degree programs that might be more suitable for someone with your background. "There's no shame in discovering that theoretical analysis isn't your strength," he had told her kindly after she had deliberately performed poorly on a midterm exam about crisis negotiation. "Many veterans find more success in applied programs, public administration perhaps, or social work." The suggestion that she lacked analytical capabilities had been particularly frustrating because analysis had been her primary military specialty. As Shadow, she had been responsible for synthesizing intelligence from multiple sources, identifying patterns that other analysts missed, and developing strategic recommendations that influence policy decisions at the highest levels of government. But maintaining her cover had required accepting these limitations, even embracing them.
She had learned to ask for help with assignments she could have completed in half the time her classmates needed. She had practiced looking confused during lectures about subjects she understood better than the professors teaching them. The hardest moments had been during class discussions about current events that she had personal knowledge of. When Professor Kensington had led a seminar about recent developments in Afghan politics, Alexis had listened to her classmates debate the effectiveness of various diplomatic initiatives, knowing that she had been personally involved in several of the operations they were analyzing. The challenge with intelligence operations, Samantha had declared during that discussion, is that military personnel lack the cultural sensitivity necessary for effective information gathering. They approach everything like a tactical problem, instead of understanding the human dynamics involved. Alexis had gripped her pen so tightly that she had nearly broken it, remembering the months she had spent learning tribal dialects, studying religious customs, and building relationships with local leaders who had initially viewed her with suspicion, but had ultimately trusted her with information that had saved hundreds of lives. Dr. Caldwell had been the most well-meaning in her condescension, regularly checking in to offer additional academic support. "We want all our students to succeed," she had explained during one of their meetings, "but we also want to be realistic about expectations. Your military service is admirable, but academic excellence requires different skills." The assumption that military service was incompatible with intellectual achievement had been a constant undercurrent in her university experience. Even faculty members who expressed respect for veterans seemed to view them as fundamentally different from real academics, worthy of support and accommodation, but not quite capable of operating at the same intellectual level as traditional students. The most frustrating part had been that Alexis had genuinely begun to doubt herself. After 3 years of carefully underperforming, of accepting limitations that weren't real, of allowing others to define her capabilities, she had started to internalize some of the assumptions her classmates made about her potential. When the SEALs had burst through her classroom window calling her by her operational code name, they had shattered more than just her academic cover. They had reminded her of who she actually was beneath the carefully constructed persona of limitation and uncertainty she had worn for 3 years. The helicopter ride to the secure briefing facility gave Alexis 30 minutes to shed 3 years of academic camouflage and remember how to be shadow again. As the Black Hawk cut through Vermont's autumn landscape, Commander Cross handed her a tablet loaded with classified intelligence that made her stomach clenched with familiar pre-mission tension. 7 operatives compromised, Cross shouted over the rotor noise, including Thompson's younger brother, Lieutenant Mark Thompson. He specifically requested you for extraction. The name hit Alexis like a physical blow. Maria Thompson had talked about her little brother constantly during their deployment together, how he was following in her footsteps, how proud she was when he made it through SEAL training, how she worried about him carrying on the family tradition of military service. Maria had died saving Alexis's life, and now her brother was trapped in the same kind of operation that had killed his sister. "What's the situation?" Alexis asked, her voice automatically shifting into the clipped, efficient tone of operational communications. The 3 years of academic uncertainty vanished as muscle memory took over. Petty Officer Parker consulted her own tablet. Intelligence asset in Kandahar has been feeding information to Taliban forces. 18 months of network building compromised. 7 operators, deep cover, extraction window closing fast. Alexis studied the satellite imagery on her screen, her mind automatically calculating routes, timing, and risk factors. The terrain was familiar. She had operated in this exact region during her last deployment with Maria. The tribal dynamics, the safe houses, the local power structures, all of it came flooding back with crystalline clarity. "Asset identification?" she asked. "The local tribal leader named Rashid Ahmadi. He was one of your primary contacts during Operation Nightingale." The betrayal cut deeper than professional disappointment. Rashid had been more than an intelligence asset. He had been someone she had trusted, someone she had spent months building a relationship with, someone who had seemed genuinely committed to peace in his region. His daughters had called her Auntie Alexis, and his wife had taught her traditional cooking techniques during the long evenings when operational security required her to blend completely into village life.
When? Alexis asked. Wheels up in 6 hours. But Shadow, Cross hesitated, there's something else. The Pentagon knows you've been inactive for 3 years. They're questioning whether you're still operationally capable. The doubt in his voice sparked something in Alexis that had been dormant since her last mission. Not anger, exactly, but a cold professional determination that her academic persona had never possessed. Are you questioning my capabilities, Commander? Something in her tone made Cross straighten almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, the easy authority she had carried as Shadow reasserted itself, and the SEAL commander found himself responding to a presence that had nothing to do with rank or title, and everything to do with proven competence under impossible circumstances. No, ma'am, just making sure you understand the stakes. They landed at a nondescript facility that Alexis recognized as a CIA safe house she had used for mission preparation during her active years. Inside, a room full of intelligence analysts and military personnel stood as she entered, a level of respect that would have been incomprehensible to her university classmates who saw her as a struggling academic. Admiral Diana Wells, whom Alexis had briefed personally on 3 previous occasions, stepped forward with an expression mixing relief and concern. Shadow, we weren't sure you'd be willing to come back. I'm not back. I'm here for Thompson's brother. That's all. Admiral Wells nodded, understanding the distinction. Fair enough. But we need to know, are you still operationally capable? 3 years of civilian life can dull reflexes, change risk tolerance. Before Alexis could respond, a voice from the back of the room interrupted. She just reviewed classified intelligence and automatically identified 17 tactical considerations that our current team missed. Major Patricia Hendricks, a military intelligence officer Alexis had worked with previously, stepped forward with a knowing smile. She spotted 3 potential extraction routes, identified the seasonal timing that makes 2 of them impossible, and calculated resource requirements for the viable option in her head while flying in a helicopter. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Alexis felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with blown operational cover and everything to do with having her capabilities recognized after 3 years of hiding them.
Furthermore, Major Hendricks continued, she identified the optimal approach vector based on tribal territorial boundaries that aren't even marked on our current maps, because she understands the local power dynamics better than our entire regional analysis team. Admiral Wells studied Alexis with renewed interest.
Is that accurate, Shadow?
Alexis felt the weight of every assumption her classmates had made about her intellectual limitations, every patronizing conversation about academic support services, every well-meaning suggestion that theoretical analysis might be beyond her capabilities. The contrast between her university persona and her actual analytical abilities felt like a chasm that couldn't be bridged. The approach Major Hendricks mentioned would work, she admitted quietly, but there's a better option through the Northern Valley. Rashid's cousin controls that territory, and their family relationship is complicated enough that he might be willing to facilitate passage if properly motivated. The silence in the room was deafening. Alexis realized she had just demonstrated the kind of cultural and tactical knowledge that took years to develop and couldn't be learned from any textbook or briefing. How could you possibly know about family dynamics in a remote Afghan valley? Asked a young analyst who clearly hadn't been briefed on Alexis's operational history. Because I lived with Rashid's extended family for 8 months. I attended his cousin's wedding. I helped mediate a dispute between their fathers over water rights. I know which of his sons are likely to support him and which ones think he's made too many compromises with Western forces. The room erupted in quiet murmurs as personnel realized they were dealing with someone whose knowledge went well beyond what any intelligence file could contain. These weren't analytical assessments based on reports and satellite imagery. This was personal, intimate knowledge of the people and places that would determine mission success or failure. Commander Cross looked at Admiral Wells with an expression that clearly said, "I told you so." This is why we needed Shadow specifically. This isn't just a tactical extraction, it's a cultural negotiation that requires someone who understands all the players personally. Alexis felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling on her shoulders, but also something else, a profound relief at finally being able to use capabilities she had spent 3 years pretending not to possess.
For the first time since the seals had burst through her classroom window, she allowed herself to think like the operator she had trained to be, rather than the struggling student she had pretended to be. But as the mission parameters took shape, Alexis couldn't shake the feeling that returning to this world meant abandoning something valuable she had discovered during her 3 years as a student. The question wasn't whether she could still operate at this level. Clearly she could. The question was whether she wanted to.
While Alexis was being briefed on classified operations 3 states away, the chaos she had left behind at Northfield University was spiraling into a media frenzy that threatened to expose everything she had worked to keep hidden. Professor Kensington sat in Dean Caldwell's office, watching news vans multiply in the parking lot outside while trying to process the complete transformation of his understanding of one of his students. Federal agents have been calling every 10 minutes, Dr. Caldwell said, rubbing her temples as another phone rang in the outer office. They want all of Alexis's academic records, her housing information, her emergency contacts. They've classified everything about her as related to national security. Professor Kensington stared at the gradebook open on his laptop. Alexis Beaumont, enrolled 3 years ago with solid but unremarkable test scores, consistently performed at B+ level, rarely participated in class discussions, seemed to struggle with theoretical concepts. Nothing in her academic record suggested any connection to military operations sophisticated enough to warrant SEAL team extraction. There has to be some mistake, he said for the 4th time that day. She was taking her international relations final. She was worried about her grade point average. Just last week, she asked for extra credit opportunities. Through the window, they could see students gathering in clusters, their phones out as they recorded social media videos about the morning's dramatic events. #Navy SEAL Classroom was already trending on multiple platforms, with speculation ranging from terrorist threats to government conspiracies. Owen Fletcher knocked on the office door, his face pale with concern. Dr. Caldwell, the media is asking students for interviews about Alexis. Some of them are saying things that, well, they're not very kind. Dr. Caldwell gestured for him to sit down. What kind of things? Samantha Clark gave an interview to Channel 7. She said Alexis was clearly unstable, that she always seemed suspicious and secretive, that she probably had PTSD and shouldn't have been allowed in classes with other students. Owen's voice carried disgust. She's making it sound like Alexis was dangerous. Professor Kensington felt sick. 3 hours ago, Samantha had been offering to tutor Alexis in basic international relations concepts. Now she was portraying herself as having been afraid of her all along. What about the other students? Dr. Caldwell asked. Brittany Walsh is telling everyone she always knew there was something off about Alexis. She's claiming she tried to warn people that Alexis's academic work showed signs of military indoctrination and inability to think critically. Owen shook his head. It's like they're rewriting history to make themselves look smart instead of admitting they completely misjudged someone. The irony wasn't lost on Professor Kensington. For 3 years, he had watched Alexis defer to these same students in class discussions, accepting their condescending explanations of concepts she apparently understood better than anyone in the room. He thought about all the times she had asked him for clarification on theories she could probably have taught herself, all the office hours she had spent listening to his advice about academic strategies she clearly didn't need. His phone buzzed with a text from his department chair. Media wanting statement on Beaumont's academic performance. What should I tell them? Professor Kensington stared at the message, unsure how to answer. What was Alexis's academic performance, really? The grades in his system showed a competent but unremarkable student. But knowing what he knew now, those grades felt like an elaborate performance designed to hide capabilities that would have raised uncomfortable questions. Professor Kensington, Owen said quietly, I've been thinking about some of the things Alexis said in class. Comments that seemed insightful, but she always backed down when other students challenged her. What if she wasn't backing down because she was uncertain? What if she knew too much? The observation hit Professor Kensington like a revelation. He pulled up his mental catalog of Alexis's classroom contributions, viewing them through this new lens. Her tentative questions about counterinsurgency theory that had demonstrated knowledge of operational details not covered in any textbook. Her uncertain observations about intelligence gathering that had shown understanding of practical considerations his other students never considered. Her reluctant participation in simulations where she had briefly taken charge before catching herself and deferring to others. She was performing, he said aloud, the realization stunning him. For 3 years, she was deliberately underperforming to maintain some kind of cover. Cover for what? Dr. Caldwell asked.
Before Professor Kensington could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Professor Kensington? This is Agent Martinez, FBI. We need to discuss your student, Alexis Beaumont. There are some questions about her academic performance that we need you to clarify. Professor Kensington put the phone on speaker. What kind of questions? We've reviewed her academic records, and there are some inconsistencies we're trying to understand. Her performance seems artificially limited. Her professors consistently note that she demonstrates knowledge beyond what her test scores indicate. We need to know if you observed anything that might suggest she was deliberately underperforming. The question hung in the air as Professor Kensington realized that federal investigators had reached the same conclusion he had just arrived at. Yes, there were times when her insights seemed more sophisticated than her grades would suggest. Can you give us specific examples? Professor Kensington thought about the simulation exercise where Alexis had briefly taken charge, demonstrating knowledge of negotiation protocols that weren't covered in their curriculum. During a crisis management simulation, she showed familiarity with procedures that we don't teach at the undergraduate level. When I asked her about it, she claimed she had seen something similar in a documentary. What other anomalies did you notice? She always positioned herself with her back to walls and clear sight lines to exits. She never seemed surprised by sudden sounds that startled other students. During discussions of current events, she sometimes started to offer insights that seemed to come from personal knowledge, then caught herself and asked basic questions instead. Agent Martinez was quiet for a moment. Professor, I need you to understand that Miss Beaumont's true background is classified at the highest levels. What I can tell you is that her academic performance was a carefully maintained cover identity. The person you knew as a struggling student is actually one of the most decorated intelligence operatives in recent military history. Dr. Caldwell gasped audibly. Owen stared at Professor Kensington with wide eyes. Are you saying she was spying on the university? Dr. Caldwell asked. No, ma'am. We believe she was hiding from her past, not spying on her present. She was using her education as a way to build a civilian identity after leaving military service. Professor Kensington felt a mixture of admiration and sadness. She spent 3 years letting us think she was academically limited. She let other students condescend to her, let faculty members offer her remedial support. Why would someone with her capabilities submit to that kind of treatment? That's what we're trying to understand, Agent Martinez replied. Her psychological profile suggests she was dealing with significant trauma related to her military service. The academic environment may have provided a safe space where she could process her experiences without the pressure of operational responsibility. As the call ended, Professor Kensington sat in stunned silence. Through the window, he could see reporters interviewing students who were eager to share their opinions about the mysterious classmate they had never really known. The narrative being constructed was one of deception and potential danger. But Professor Kensington now understood it was actually a story of someone so damaged by her service to her country that she had been willing to endure years of academic humiliation just to find peace. His phone buzzed with another text, this time from Samantha Clark. Professor, I'm getting interview requests from national news. Should I tell them about how Alexis always seemed unstable in class? Professor Kensington stared at the message, thinking about the woman who had spent 3 years graciously accepting condescending study group invitations from someone who didn't possess a fraction of her actual knowledge and experience. He thought about the choice Alexis had made every day to remain small and quiet, rather than claim the recognition her capabilities deserved. He typed back, I'd recommend saying nothing until we know more facts. But he knew the damage was already done. By tomorrow, the narrative would be set, and the truth about Alexis's sacrifice, choosing peace over recognition, healing over validation, would be lost in speculation about government conspiracies and national security threats.
The woman who had spent 3 years hiding her light under a bushel was about to be exposed to a world that would never understand why she had chosen darkness in the first place.
The secure video conference connected Alexis with a room full of Pentagon officials, CIA analysts, and military commanders who represented the highest levels of American intelligence operations. As her image appeared on their screens, she could see the mixture of relief and concern on faces she had briefed during some of the most critical operations of the past decade. "Shadow," General Patricia Stone began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had personally signed off on Alexis's most dangerous assignments. "We need to discuss your status. Your academic cover has been completely blown. Every major news network is running stories about the mysterious student who was extracted by Navy SEALs. Your civilian identity is no longer viable." Alexis felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life crumbling in real time. How bad is the exposure? Colonel Sandra Phillips, who had been Alexis's handler during her final deployment, pulled up a tablet showing news coverage. "Social media has identified you as Alexis Beaumont, former student at Northfield University. They have photos, academic records, interviews with classmates. But they don't know about Shadow yet." "Yet," Admiral Wells emphasized. "But investigative journalists are already digging. It's only a matter of time before someone connects Alexis Beaumont to Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Reeves, and from there to Shadow. Once that happens, 18 months of deep cover operations become public knowledge." The name Alexandra Reeves hit Alexis like a physical blow. She hadn't heard her real name spoken aloud in 3 years. Alexandra Reeves had been the woman who had earned a Silver Star for actions in Syria, who had been personally commended by 3 different secretaries of defense, who had developed intelligence networks that had prevented countless terrorist attacks. Alexis Beaumont had been the grieving woman who just wanted to read textbooks and write papers about international relations without anyone dying because of her decisions. "There's more," General Stone continued. "Your classmates are giving interviews. Some of them are portraying you as unstable, dangerous, someone who is clearly hiding something sinister. The narrative being constructed is not favorable." Alexis thought about Samantha Clark and Brittany Walsh, who had spent 3 years offering her patronizing academic advice while she bit her tongue to keep from correcting their fundamental misunderstandings about international relations theory. Now they were rewriting history to make themselves look like they had been suspicious of her all along. "What about the people who actually knew me?" she asked, thinking of Owen Fletcher and Professor Kensington, who had treated her with genuine kindness. "Professor Kensington has refused all interview requests," Colonel Phillips reported. "Owen Fletcher issued a statement defending your character, but it's being overshadowed by more sensational claims from other students." Major Hendricks leaned forward on the screen. "Shadow, we need to discuss your options. The civilian life you built is gone. The question is what you want to build next." For 3 years, Alexis had been Alexandra Reeves pretending to be Alexis Beaumont. The performance had been so complete that sometimes she had forgotten which identity was real. But sitting in this briefing room, surrounded by classified intelligence and operational planning documents, she realized that both identities had been incomplete. "I need to know what happened to Maria Thompson," she said quietly. The room fell silent. General Stone's expression softened slightly. "Shadow, we've discussed this. The IED that killed Staff Sergeant Thompson was—" "No," Alexis interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that made even the generals pause. "I need to know what really happened. Not the sanitized version in my debriefing reports. Not the story that made it easier for everyone to move on. I need to know the truth." Admiral Wells exchanged glances with several other officials before nodding slowly. "Very well. Colonel Phillips will brief you on the classified details of Operation Nightingale." For the next 30 minutes, Alexis learned truths that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about her best friend's death. The IED hadn't been a random attack by insurgent forces. It had been a targeted assassination attempt against Shadow herself, planned and executed by the same network she was now being asked to help dismantle.
Rashid Ahmadi wasn't just feeding information to Taliban forces. He was specifically tracking your movements, your safe houses, your local contacts. The explosion that killed Thompson was meant to kill you.
The revelation hit Alexis like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had carried the guilt of surviving when Maria hadn't. Now she understood that Maria's death had been a direct result of Alexis's own operational effectiveness. She hadn't just lost her best friend in a random act of war, she had gotten her killed by being too good at her job. "Why wasn't I told this at the time?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you were too valuable to lose," General Stone replied bluntly. "Your psychological evaluation indicated that learning the truth might have caused you to refuse future assignments. We needed Shadow operational." The casual admission that her superiors had withheld information that might have helped her process her grief sparked something cold and angry in Alexis's chest. "So you let me blame myself for 3 years? You let me think I had made some tactical error that got my best friend killed?" "We let you think what you needed to think to stay functional," Admiral Wells replied without apology. Shadow's work was too important to risk on one operator's emotional stability. Alexis stood up slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the room. For 3 years, she had hidden from operational responsibility because she thought her judgment had been compromised by grief and guilt. Now she understood that her judgment had been compromised by lies and manipulation from the very people who were supposed to support her. "You want to know why I disappeared?" she said, her voice carrying a controlled fury that made several officers unconsciously straighten in their chairs. "It wasn't because I couldn't handle the operational tempo. It wasn't because I was traumatized by combat. It was because I couldn't trust the people giving me orders." "Shadow," General Stone began. "My name is Alexis. Shadow was an identity you created, trained, and deployed. But Shadow was also someone you lied to, manipulated, and ultimately betrayed. If you want my help with this operation, it will be as Alexis, not as Shadow." The distinction seemed small, but everyone in the room understood its significance. Shadow had been a tool of the military intelligence apparatus, someone whose personal needs were subordinate to operational requirements. Alexis was someone who would make her own decisions about what she was willing to sacrifice and why. "The operation parameters remain the same," Admiral Wells said carefully. 7 operatives need extraction, including Mark Thompson. The window for action is closing rapidly. "I'll help you get them out," Alexis replied. "But when this is over, I'm done. No more operations, no more classified briefings, no more being told comfortable lies to keep me functional. I'm going back to my life." General Stone looked at her with something that might have been respect. "What life? Your academic cover is blown, your civilian identity is compromised. Where exactly do you think you can go back to?" It was a fair question, and one Alexis didn't have a complete answer to. But as she looked around the room full of officials who had spent 3 years letting her carry guilt that wasn't hers to bear, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever life she built next would be on her own terms, not theirs. "That's my problem to solve," she said. "Right now, let's focus on bringing Mark Thompson and his team home alive."
The C-130 transport plane carrying Alexis toward Afghanistan gave her 8 hours to contemplate the impossible choice that lay ahead. In her hands, she held 2 documents that represented completely different futures. The first was a reinstatement offer from the Pentagon, full restoration of her security clearance, promotion to colonel, and command of her own intelligence unit with unlimited resources and operational authority. The second was a handwritten letter from Owen Fletcher that had somehow been cleared through military censors. "Dear Alexis," Owen's letter began, "I don't know where you are or what's really happening, but I wanted you to know that some of us understood you were more than you pretended to be. Not because we suspected you were hiding something dangerous, but because genuine kindness is rare enough that it's impossible to fake for 3 years. Whatever brought you to our classroom, I'm grateful it did.
You made me a better scholar and a better person just by being yourself, whatever version of yourself that was." The letter went on to describe how Professor Kensington had defended her character to federal investigators, how several students had begun questioning their own assumptions about veterans in academic ability, and how the International Relations Department was considering restructuring their curriculum to better accommodate diverse backgrounds and learning styles. "You changed our little corner of the academic world," Owen concluded, "not through any dramatic revelation or confrontation, but through 3 years of quiet dignity and authentic engagement with ideas. That's the Alexis I hope you choose to remain, wherever your path leads next." Major Hendricks, who was accompanying her on the mission, noticed her reading the letter for the 3rd time. "Personal correspondence?" "Something like that," Alexis replied, folding the letter carefully. "A reminder of who I became when I wasn't trying to be someone else." The mission briefing materials spread across her lap told a different story about who she could become. The Pentagon's reinstatement offer wasn't just about returning to her old position. It was about advancement to levels of responsibility she had never imagined. Command of joint intelligence operations across 3 theaters, direct access to cabinet-level briefings, the authority to shape American foreign policy through strategic intelligence analysis. "Shadow," Major Hendricks, using the call sign deliberately, said, "Can I ask you something?" "Alexis," she corrected automatically. "Alexis, then. Why did you really leave? I've read your psychological evaluations, your debriefing reports, your medical records. None of them explain why someone at the peak of their operational effectiveness would walk away from the most important intelligence work in the world." Alexis looked out the small window at the landscape passing below, the same terrain where she had once operated with absolute confidence in her mission and her superiors. "Because I realized I had become so good at being Shadow that I had forgotten who Alexandra Reeves was supposed to be. And when Maria died, I couldn't tell the difference between grief over losing my best friend and guilt over failing my mission. But now you know the truth about what happened to Thompson. Now I know that my superiors were willing to let me carry false guilt for 3 years because it served their operational needs. That's not an organization I want to build my life around." Major Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "The work we do matters. The intelligence you gathered, the networks you built, the operations you enabled, they saved thousands of lives." "I know, and that's what makes this choice so impossible." Alexis picked up the Pentagon reinstatement offer, scanning through pages of responsibilities that would put her at the center of America's most critical national security decisions. "I could go back to being Shadow. I could command resources that would let me prevent attacks, stop conflicts before they start, protect people who will never know their lives were in danger. But I believe I would be better able to carry out the right operations in a classroom or in the international relations world than in a government office. Do you know what I learned studying political theory instead of implementing political strategy? I learned that most of the ethical frameworks we use to justify intelligence operations were developed by people who never had to live with the human consequences of those decisions."
She pulled out her tablet and showed Major Hendricks a paper she had written for Professor Kensington's ethics seminar. "I spent 6 months analyzing the moral implications of information gathering in civilian populations, not from an operational perspective, but from a philosophical one. The conclusions were uncomfortable." Major Hendricks read through the abstract, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph. "You're questioning the fundamental assumptions underlying intelligence work. I'm questioning whether the versions of democracy and freedom we claim to be protecting are compatible with the methods we use to protect them," Alexis replied. "And I'm questioning whether I can continue participating in a system that answers those questions by withholding information from the people doing the actual work." The plane began its descent toward the forward operating base where the rescue mission would be launched. Through the windows, Alexis could see the familiar landscape of a war zone. The harsh beauty of mountains that concealed dangers, the geometric patterns of human settlements that represented both opportunity and threat.
There's a third option, Major Hendricks said quietly. Alexis looked at her with interest. The Pentagon has been discussing the creation of a new position, someone who bridges the gap between operational intelligence and academic analysis, someone who can evaluate our methods and assumptions with both practical experience and theoretical knowledge. You want me to become a military ethicist? We want you to become someone who makes sure we're asking the right questions before we start looking for answers. Someone who can tell us when our operational effectiveness is undermining our strategic objectives. The offer was intriguing in ways that Alexis hadn't expected. It would allow her to use both sides of her experience, the operational knowledge that came from years as Shadow, and the analytical framework she had developed during her academic exile. More importantly, it would position her to influence the moral dimensions of intelligence work rather than simply implementing decisions made by others. What would that actually look like? You'd review proposed operations for ethical implications. You'd develop training programs that help operatives understand the broader context of their work. You'd advise senior leadership on the long-term consequences of tactical decisions. Alexis considered the possibility. It would mean remaining connected to the intelligence community without being subsumed by it. It would allow her to advocate for the kind of moral framework she had been developing through her academic work, while still contributing to missions that protected innocent lives. And I could maintain academic affiliations, continue developing theoretical frameworks alongside practical applications? That would actually be encouraged. We need someone who can communicate with both communities, military and academic. As the plane touched down on the rough airstrip, Alexis realized that the choice she faced wasn't really between her old life and her new one. It was between accepting limitations imposed by others and creating possibilities that hadn't existed before. The rescue mission ahead would test whether she could operate effectively with this new understanding of herself and her capabilities. But regardless of how the next 48 hours unfolded, she knew that she would never again allow others to define the scope of her contributions or the framework of her moral responsibilities. The woman who had spent 3 years hiding from her past was about to discover what she could build when she integrated everything she had learned into something entirely new.
The compound where Mark Thompson and his team were being held sat in a valley that Alexis knew better than her own hometown. Every ridge, every goat path, every family compound within a 5-mile radius held memories from her previous deployment with Maria Thompson. As she studied the real-time satellite imagery, she could practically hear Maria's voice providing commentary about tactical approaches and local politics. "Entry team is in position," Commander Cross recorded through her earpiece. "Shadow, we're ready for your signal." But Alexis wasn't looking at the target compound anymore. Her attention had shifted to a smaller building 300 meters to the south, Rashid Ahmadi's family home, where she had spent countless evenings building the trust relationship that had ultimately gotten Maria killed. "Negative on the breach," she said quietly. "I'm going in alone first." "Shadow, that's not the plan. We extract the hostages and neutralize the threat. Clean and simple." "Nothing about this situation is clean or simple," Alexis replied, already moving toward the compound perimeter. "Rashid didn't just betray our operations, he betrayed 3 years of personal relationship. I need to understand why." What she didn't tell Commander Cross was that she had spotted something in the satellite imagery that had made her blood run cold. Children's clothing hanging on a line behind Rashid's house. The same compound where intelligence suggested he was coordinating with Taliban forces was also home to his family, including the 2 daughters who had called her Auntie Alexis. Major Hendricks's voice crackled through the comms. "Alexis, don't let personal history compromise mission objectives." "Personal history is the only thing that's going to get our people alive, Alexis," replied Alexis, already scaling the compound wall with the fluid efficiency of someone for whom such movements were muscle memory. The courtyard looked exactly as she remembered. Worn stones, a small garden where Rashid's wife grew herbs, children's toys scattered near the house. But now it felt like a stage set for a confrontation that had been 3 years in the making.
Rashid Ahmadi emerged from the house as if he had been expecting her. He looked older than she remembered, lines of stress etched around his eyes, but his bearing still carried the dignity that had made their original partnership possible. "Sister Alexis," he said in Pashto, using the familial address that had once indicated genuine affection. "You should not have come here." "Brother Rashid," she replied in the same language, keeping her hands visible but ready. "We need to talk about Mark Thompson and his team." Rashid's expression shifted, surprise replacing the resignation she had expected. "You know about the American prisoners? I know you're holding them. I know you've been feeding information to Taliban commanders. What I don't know is why someone who spent months telling me about his dreams for peace in this region would choose to become part of the violence." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the courtyard where they had once shared meals and discussed philosophy. When Rashid finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "My youngest daughter, Fatima, was killed 6 months ago in an American drone strike. She was visiting her grandmother in Kandahar. The intelligence that guided that strike came from networks we built together." The words hit Alexis like a physical blow. Fatima was 8 years old when Alexis last saw her, a bright, curious child who had insisted on teaching her traditional songs and drew pictures of flowers that Alexis still carried in her personal kit. "Rashid, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know," he interrupted, his voice carrying a bitterness that was painful to hear. "You gathered information, passed it up the chain, and trusted that someone else would make wise decisions about how to use it. But wisdom and vengeance look very similar when viewed through satellite imagery." Alexis felt the foundations of her moral framework shifting beneath her feet. The intelligence network she had built with Rashid hadn't just saved American lives, they had also enabled strikes that killed civilians, including people she had personally cared about. "So you decided to burn it all down," she said, understanding flooding through her. "I decided to make sure that the Americans understood what it felt like to lose people they cared about to decisions made by strangers in distant places." The explanation was logical, comprehensible, and morally devastating. Alexis realized that every ethical framework she had developed during her academic years had failed to account for this scenario, where good intelligence work could produce tragic, unintended consequences that would radicalize even moderate allies. "Where are Thompson and his team?" she asked.
Rashid gestured toward the main compound. "Safe, for now, but the commanders I'm working with want to make an example of them. Public executions, broadcast propaganda, the full spectacle of American defeat." "And you're going to let that happen?" "I'm going to do what I must to ensure that my surviving children have a future in a world where their father is seen as someone who fought back against injustice, rather than someone who collaborated with forces that killed their sister." The complexity of Rashid's position made Alexis's chest tight with recognition. He was trapped between impossible loyalties, just as she had been trapped between her identity as Shadow and her identity as Alexis. "There's another way," she said quietly. "What way?" "You help me get the Americans out, and I help you get your family to safety. Somewhere far from here, where your children can grow up without the weight of their father's choices defining their futures." Rashid studied her face, looking for deception or manipulation. "Why would you do that? After what I've done to your operations, to your people?" "Because 3 years ago, you taught me that the most important battles aren't fought between armies. They're fought in the hearts of individuals trying to do right by the people they love. You're not my enemy, Rashid. You're a father who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation." For the first time since their conversation began, something like hope flickered in Rashid's eyes. "The Taliban commanders will never allow it. They want American blood." "Then we give them something else," Alexis said, pulling out her satellite phone. "Commander Cross, I need you to listen very carefully. We're going to stage a rescue operation that fails." "Shadow, what the hell are you talking about?" "Alexis," she corrected automatically.
And I'm talking about a plan that gets our people out while giving the local commanders a propaganda victory they can use to justify letting a moderate tribal leader live. As she outlined her strategy, Alexis realized she was using both sides of her experience, the tactical knowledge that came from years as Shadow, and the ethical reasoning she had developed during her academic exile. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't compartmentalizing different aspects of her identity. She was integrating them into something that served both operational effectiveness and moral coherence. The plan that emerged was risky, complex, and required levels of trust between former allies who had every reason to see each other as enemies. But as Alexis looked across the courtyard at Rashid, she saw not the man who had betrayed her operations, but the father who was trying to protect his children in a world where protection required impossible compromises. If the plan worked, 7 American operatives would go home alive, and an Afghan family would get a chance to build a life somewhere safe. If it failed, everyone involved would probably die. But for the first time in 3 years, Alexis was completely certain that the risk was worth taking.
The failed rescue operation unfolded exactly as Alexis had planned. To external observers, American Special Forces had attempted a high-risk extraction that had been repelled by superior Taliban tactics, resulting in the humiliating retreat of elite military units. The propaganda value was enormous. Local commanders could claim victory over the same American operatives who had been terrorizing their region for months. What those observers didn't see was the carefully choreographed extraction that had taken place during the chaos. While smoke grenades and controlled explosions created the illusion of fierce resistance, Mark Thompson and his 6 teammates had been quietly moved through a network of tunnels that only Rashid's family knew existed. By the time the defeated American forces withdrew, their primary objective had been accomplished. Rashid's family had vanished during the same operation, officially killed in the crossfire, but actually transported to a safe house near the Pakistani border. Within 48 hours, they would be on a refugee transport to Germany, where a new life awaited them under identities that would protect them from reprisals by both Taliban commanders and American intelligence services. Now, 3 weeks later, Alexis sat in a conference room at the Pentagon, facing the same officials who had tried to convince her to return to active duty as Shadow. But the woman addressing them bore little resemblance to either the broken operative who had fled to academia or the uncertain student who had hidden her capabilities. The Ahmadi operation succeeded because we treated local assets as human beings with complex motivations rather than intelligence resources to be managed, she explained to the room full of generals and analysts. Rashid's betrayal wasn't the result of ideological conversion or financial incentive. It was the response of a father whose child had been killed by systems we had helped create. Admiral Wells shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Shadow, Alexis, while we appreciate the successful extraction, your methods raised serious concerns about operational security and chain of command protocols. My methods worked, Alexis replied evenly. 7 American operatives are alive because we addressed the human dimension of intelligence work rather than treating it as a purely tactical problem. General Stone leaned forward. But at what cost? You compromised ongoing operations, revealed sensitive techniques, and negotiated with enemy combatants without authorization. I prevented a propaganda disaster that would have set back American interests in the region by years, Alexis countered. More importantly, I demonstrated that it's possible to achieve operational objectives while maintaining ethical coherence. She stood and activated the presentation screen behind her, displaying a comprehensive analysis she had prepared during her flight back from Afghanistan. For the past 3 weeks, I've been developing a framework for intelligence operations that integrates tactical effectiveness with moral responsibility. What you're seeing is a new approach to asset management, one that treats local partners as allies rather than resources.
The presentation outlined specific protocols for cultural integration, ethical evaluation of intelligence gathering techniques, and long-term relationship management that went far beyond traditional operational timelines. It drew heavily on both her military experience and her academic training, creating something that hadn't existed in either community. "This is very theoretical," Colonel Phillips observed. "How do you propose implementing these concepts in real-world operations?" "By creating a new position within the intelligence community," Alexis replied. "Someone who serves as a bridge between operational necessity and ethical responsibility. Someone who can evaluate proposed operations not just for tactical viability, but for long-term strategic and moral implications." Major Hendricks smiled slightly. "The position we discussed on the transport plane." "An expanded version of that position," Alexis corrected. "I've spent the past 3 weeks consulting with academic colleagues at Northfield University, developing a curriculum that could train a new generation of intelligence professionals, people who understand both the practical requirements of field work and the theoretical frameworks necessary for ethical decision-making." Admiral Wells looked intrigued despite her concerns. "You're talking about fundamentally changing how we approach intelligence gathering." "I'm talking about evolution," Alexis replied. "For too long, we've treated ethical considerations and operational effectiveness as competing priorities. My experience suggests they're actually complementary when properly integrated."
She clicked to the next slide, showing an organizational chart that positioned ethical advisors at every level of intelligence operations. Imagine operations planned by teams that include both tactical specialists and moral philosophers. Imagine asset relationships built on genuine partnership rather than manipulation. Imagine long-term strategies that consider the human costs of our methods. General Stone was quiet for a long moment. "And you believe this approach would make our intelligence operations more effective, not less?" "I believe it would make our intelligence operations sustainable," Alexis replied. "The Rashid situation demonstrates what happens when we treat people as expendable resources. Eventually, they push back, and we lose more than we ever gained." She thought about the 3 years she had spent in Professor Kensington's classroom, engaging with ethical frameworks that had seemed purely theoretical at the time. Now she understood that those frameworks weren't abstract philosophical exercises. They were practical tools for navigating the moral complexity of real-world decisions. "There's something else," she continued. "I want to establish a joint program between the intelligence community and academic institutions, a way for operatives to develop ethical reasoning skills alongside tactical capabilities, and for academics to understand the practical constraints that shape policy decisions." The idea was ambitious, possibly revolutionary. It would require unprecedented cooperation between communities that had traditionally viewed each other with suspicion. But Alexis had learned that the most important innovations happened at the intersection of different perspectives. "Where would this program be based?" Admiral Wells asked. "Northfield University has agreed to host the pilot program. Professor Kensington and Dean Caldwell are enthusiastic about developing curriculum that bridges theoretical and practical approaches to international relations." She thought about Owen Fletcher, who had sent her another letter expressing excitement about the possibility of working with intelligence professionals on research projects that could influence real-world policy. Even Samantha Clark and Brittany Walsh had reached out, apologizing for their earlier assumptions and expressing interest in learning from her experience. I should mention that the program would be open to veterans transitioning to civilian careers, as well as civilians interested in government service. The goal is to create a community of practice that spans traditional institutional boundaries. General Stone studied the organizational charts and curriculum outlines spread across the conference table. "This is unprecedented. We're talking about fundamental changes to classification protocols, operational security, academic freedom, institutional cooperation. We're talking about preparing for a future where the most important battles will be fought not between armies, but between competing visions of human dignity and social organization. The side that develops more effective ways of integrating moral reasoning with practical action will have decisive advantages." As the meeting concluded, Alexis realized that she had found a way to honor both sides of her experience.
She wouldn't have to choose between being Shadow or Alexis, between operational effectiveness and ethical coherence, between military service and academic inquiry. She could build something new that integrated all of these elements into a more complete approach to the challenges facing her generation. The woman who had spent 3 years hiding from her past had discovered how to transform both her experience and her pain into something that could help others navigate similar challenges. The question now was whether institutions that had operated in isolation for decades would be willing to risk the vulnerability that genuine collaboration required.
2 years later, Alexis stood at the front of a classroom that looked remarkably similar to the one where Navy SEALs had once burst through windows to extract her from her finals. But this classroom was different in ways that would have been unimaginable during her time as a hidden student. The walls displayed maps marked with operational zones alongside philosophical frameworks for ethical decision-making. Students in military uniforms sat next to civilian graduate students, all engaged in discussions about the intersection of practical action and moral responsibility. Today we're going to examine a case study, Alexis announced to her Advanced Ethics in Intelligence Operations seminar. An American operative builds a relationship with a local asset over 18 months. The intelligence gathered prevents multiple terrorist attacks and saves hundreds of lives. But the same intelligence network later enables a drone strike that kills the asset's child. How do we evaluate the moral implications of this outcome? The question that had once tormented her personally had become a teaching tool that helped others grapple with similar complexities. Owen Fletcher, now pursuing a joint PhD in international relations and applied ethics, raised his hand from the front row. Professor Beaumont, shouldn't we start by examining the decision-making structures that allowed operational intelligence to be used without consideration of civilian casualties? Alexis smiled at the title that still felt strange after 2 years. Excellent point, Owen. Who can identify the systemic factors that contributed to this tragedy? Captain Sarah Martinez, a former intelligence analyst transitioning to civilian policy work, responded thoughtfully. The compartmentalization of information meant that the people making targeting decisions never had access to the relationship dynamics that the field operative understood. And what does that suggest about how we might restructure these processes? Alexis asked. Lieutenant James Chen, fresh from a deployment in Syria, leaned forward eagerly. We need better integration between tactical intelligence and strategic decision-making. Field operatives should have input into how their intelligence is used. The discussion that followed would have been impossible in either a traditional military briefing or a conventional academic seminar. Students who had lived through the practical challenges of intelligence work engaged with theoretical frameworks developed by scholars who had never left university campuses. The result was a kind of analysis that neither community could have achieved alone. After class, Alexis walked across campus to her second office, the one that housed the Ethics and Intelligence Integration program she now directed. The hallways buzzed with activity that reflected the program's success in bridging institutional boundaries. Retired military officers attended seminars on moral philosophy. University professors participated in realistic simulations of operational decision-making. Graduate students worked on research projects that would influence both academic theory and government policy. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, her expression mixing pride with amazement. "Alexis, you have visitors. Mark Thompson and his team are here for their graduation ceremony." Alexis felt her heart skip. Mark Thompson and the 6 operatives she had helped extract from Afghanistan had all enrolled in the program after completing their military service. Watching them transition from tactical thinking to ethical analysis had been deeply satisfying, but also emotionally challenging given the connection to his sister Maria. In the main conference room, 7 men in civilian clothes stood around a table displaying their master's thesis projects. Mark Thompson approached her with a smile that carried both gratitude and understanding. "Professor, we wanted to thank you personally before the ceremony tonight," he said. "This program didn't just help us transition to civilian careers, it helped us understand what Maria was trying to accomplish during her service." The mention of his sister still caused Alexis a pang of grief, but it was no longer the overwhelming guilt that had driven her into academic exile.
Through her work with Mark and his teammates, she had learned that the best way to honor Maria's memory was to ensure that future operatives had the ethical framework to make better decisions than the ones that had gotten Maria killed. "What are your plans after graduation?" she asked. "3 of us are joining the State Department's new Ethical Policy Analysis Division," Mark replied. 2 are returning to active duty as ethics advisors embedded with special operations units. Johnson is starting a PhD program to develop training protocols for cultural sensitivity in intelligence gathering. "And you?" Mark smiled. "I'm staying here as a doctoral student. I want to research how personal relationships in intelligence work can be maintained without compromising either operational effectiveness or individual dignity." The research agenda he described would have been impossible to imagine when Alexis was hiding in this same university, pretending to struggle with concepts she understood better than her professors. Now it represented the cutting edge of both academic inquiry and practical policy development. That evening, the graduation ceremony took place in the university's main auditorium, filled with an unprecedented mix of military officials, academic administrators, intelligence professionals, and family members. As Alexis delivered the keynote address, she looked out over an audience that represented everything she had hoped to achieve through the program. 3 years ago, she began, I was sitting in this university as a student who was hiding from her past and uncertain about her future. Tonight, I am addressing graduates who represent the future of ethical leadership in international relations. People who understand that the most important battles of our time will be won not through tactical superiority, but through moral clarity. She paused, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The choice between effectiveness and ethics is a false choice. The choice between practical action and moral responsibility is a false choice. The choice between military service and academic inquiry is a false choice. The future belongs to people who refuse to accept these artificial limitations and who work to integrate the best of all perspectives. After the ceremony, Alexis walked across campus to the dormitory where she had once lived as a hidden student. The building looked the same, but she felt like a completely different person from the one who had once sat in these rooms, carefully maintaining a cover identity that diminished her capabilities. Her phone buzzed with a message from Rashid Ahmadi, now living safely in Germany with his family. The messages came monthly, updates on his children's progress in school, photos of family gatherings, expressions of gratitude for the second chance they had all been given. His eldest daughter was planning to study international relations when she reached university age, a choice that seemed to symbolize hope for a future where understanding might replace conflict. As Alexis looked back at the building where Navy SEALs had once burst through windows to extract her from her hidden life, she realized that the most important extraction had been the one she had performed on herself. She had rescued her own capabilities from the limitations others had imposed, her own sense of purpose from the guilt that had nearly destroyed it, and her own future from the artificial choice between competing aspects of her identity. The woman who had once been forced to choose between Shadow and Alexis had become someone entirely new, a person who proved that the most powerful transformations happened not when you chose one path over another, but when you had the courage to create a path that hadn't existed before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.